Circulated very often in magazines. Printed in magazines for circulation, and these are magazines that would feature heavy-duty articles such as what does Karl Marx think, blah, blah, blah subjects, or the state of the world, when might Stalin respond to Hitler? So you get the picture, right? Or discussions about, say, global economic recession. So these woodblock prints very often would circulate in that kind of magazines. And occasionally there are also albums of these woodblock prints in circulation on their own. So the critical intent is very, very much there, and then also the artistic inspiration tends to be Eastern European and Russian. Unlike our color posters, which would look to, say, Life magazine as samples. I'm sorry, yeah, people? No, they were not limited to intellectuals. The interesting thing about Shanghai was that there is a fairly broad range of middle class that would do the reading. So in other words, all the way from the top to the middle or lower middle class would be reading, circulating would be readers of these images as well as magazines. And these magazines very often would be read, say, one subscriber, and yet infinite rounds of additional circulation. So it's not simply one subscriber, one reader. That one reader, in turn, would loan the copy to many friends, shop apprentices, and lower-ranking government clerks. In other words, people with secondary school education background and desk jobs, and yet fairly limited prospects for career advancement. These people tend to be avid readers of woodblock prints and heavy-duty journals with very strong social protest messages. Well, the great thing about Shanghai within these two concessions is nationalist government censorship was unable to reach into it. So the only thing, and there is no constraint on printing, publishing, and writing, the only censorship, or the only way that nationalist censorship was able to affect these areas was that when the journals or magazines or publications attempted to distribute inland into other parts of China using the postal service system, then the postal services on the receiving end, right, you can mail it out through the Shanghai postal service system. But on the receiving end, say the journal hits Nanchang, the Nanchang Postal Service might be instructed to destroy the whichever issue of whatever magazine, all of them, prevent those from being distributed. So that was the only way that nationalist censorship was able to exercise in that context. But a lot of people simply carry these journals when they travel, when they go home. I mean, it was about 3 days boat ride from Shanghai to Nanchang, for instance. They just take that home. And then, right, so it was sort of a fairly direct distribution. Please.
When the French concession had to give up their extraterritorial rights,
Mm-hmm. The Americans and the British jointly declared that they gave up on all treaty rights in China in 1942, shortly after Pearl Harbor. As they entered the war, the Pacific War, declared war against Japan, right, in 1942, and built alliance with China's wartime resistance government. So the Americans and the British did the same thing at the same time, shortly after Pearl Harbor, when they declared war against Japan. I mean, for all de facto purposes, it was the Japanese, right, who were running around in those concessions. The Chinese had already been squeezed out.
Would you discuss the other international concessions in other cities of China compared to Shanghai?
Well,
because I know Tianjin,
right, okay. That's an excellent question. Now, for two purposes that we are leaving them out. One is, since our show is about Shanghai, especially this kind of Shanghai images, Shanghai modernity, right? That even though there were concessions elsewhere, when it comes to the publishing, printing, manufacturing, and advertising business, Shanghai was unquestionably number one. And these other cities did not quite have the same level of activity or design products, not because there were no foreign concessions, but because there was a less developed printing, publishing, advertising, trading set of activities. So what I do not mean to suggest, and I'm glad that we now have a chance to clarify that, is that those Shanghai images that we are looking at, even though these were images that had been produced on site within the territorial boundaries of foreign concessions, but foreign concessions alone, right, do not produce those images. There had to be that comparable level of development across the board in printing, especially in advertising, manufacturing, and import-export for the phenomenon to be obtained. And then Tianjin was next to Shanghai. It's probably the only other city in Shanghai to host. I mean, Tianjin had 9 foreign concessions, and not just Shanghai merely had 2. Tianjin had 9. Tianjin also hosted concessions with, say, Belgium authorities, Italian authorities in China. Now, for my Italian colleagues tend to be particularly excited about Tianjin because for Italy to be an imperial power anywhere on earth, to be taken seriously, Tianjin was the one and only place that they could go to. But still, those were places that did not quite feature this level of publishing, advertising, and trading activities. So in terms of, right, the cultural products, which were the posters, the images, the woodblock prints, the photographs, and so forth, Tianjin did not quite match Shanghai's level.
I wonder if you could speak a bit about the educational systems in the French concession and if they were different than the international sector, because I remember French Jesuits and
right.
Jesuit universities were different a little bit.
Right. That's a terrific question. The majority of universities, well attended by the Chinese in the international settlement, including the Episcopalian one, ultimately were Christian Protestant by denomination. In the French concession, the leading university was Aurora University, which was founded, I think it was, don't quote me on the exact date, but I think it was somewhere around 1905 when the school started by French Jesuits. And then also the initial objective was to teach Latin, to teach French so that people can read their Bible, and then also do their theological studies. Over the course of the Republican period, it developed into a full-blown university with heavier emphasis on theology and much less so on these broader general subjects as Protestant colleges tend to do. And the Catholic practice was also much more heavily represented in the French concession. So in this university, I should also mention that French Catholic priests had been active in South China from the 1860s onward. Colleges and universities weren't exactly the center of their attention. They were far more interested in building orphanages and elementary schools or educating younger children in vocational skills in connection with orphanages. And some of these orphan schools would go all the way up to what we say K to 12, but they don't, their preference seems to be doing K to 12 and not 13 to 16. So there is an interesting differentiation between the two. One of these Catholic orphanages in Shanghai was critical in the training of a large number of Shanghai artisans with regard to Western painting techniques. Watercolor, oil painting, sculpture. I think those were the principal areas. The initial idea was that these are skills necessary or ancillary to the whole organization of worship. But kids graduating from that line of training went off on their own, launched these studios. And these were studios that combined their newly acquired techniques and traditional Chinese commercial painting. So many of those painters were actually responsible for the design of some of the Shanghai posters that we have seen. Thank you.
I was just curious, what was the Chinese legal family poster advertising could be?
Tobacco. You know, the most powerful advertising firms, or the richest advertising firms in Shanghai in those days, was BAT, British American Tobacco Company. That's the company that's behind the founding of Duke University. So that was number one. And they entered the China market, the Shanghai market, as early as the 1870s, late 60s, 870s. And many of these posters, which especially calendar posters with features that looked Chinese, were actually very much done, or designs commissioned by the British American Tobacco Company. And then Chinese manufacturers in tobacco, Chinese tobacco manufacturers began to appear by the late 19-teens, 1920s. Especially in the 1920s, they tried to tell Chinese smokers that smoke Chinese if you are patriotic, right? Basically means no imports. Now, the truth of the matter was actually these so-called Chinese tobacco manufacturers actually were registered Japanese citizens, very often importing capital and equipment from Southeast China and whatever. So they were more Chinese, shall we say, by percentage than the British American Tobacco Company. But if you want to argue that they were truly 100% Chinese, well, that's kind of dubious. So in part, thanks to these guys, that in the in the late 1920s, the nationalist government, actually of Chiang Kai-shek, actually promulgated a whole set of rules telling people how, if you want to call yourself a national Chinese company, that is, or if you want to advertise saying that smoking your brand of cigarette or using your product is about consumption of national goods, right? They actually had a whole list and with check-off points so that you have to meet all that criteria, such as no more than 55% of your capital may be owned by an American, for instance. So they have a whole checklist of that sort of thing, which is, of course, it's interesting because indirectly what that tells you is that it was a highly ambiguous as well as generalized concept, what a national product of Chinese goods, that is, machine-produced Chinese national product in the 1920s and in the 1930s might be, right? Or chances are the machine itself is not made in China to begin with.
I've enjoyed your lecture very much. I was in Beijing pre-Olympics by a few months, and one of my hosts was from Shanghai, and she made a big point about she was from Shanghai, and somehow or another she was more liberated and from a more cultured city than those natives, we'll say, of Beijing. And I wondered if this continues today when we Westerners, think of Beijing as the art capital of China, contemporary art capital.
Well, if you mention this observation to anyone from Shanghai, surely this person is going to tell you, well, if you think so, you haven't seen the real Shanghai, right? There is an ongoing rivalry between the two cities, for sure. And it has become intensified over the recent decades. But then prior to that, prior to 1949, for instance, or even in the 1920s and 30s, the differentiation between the two was that Beijing was the old imperial capital. So culture was important in Beijing, but it was culture and art, high culture and art, of a sort that's far more closely associated with the imperial court than anything that Shanghai could claim. So for Shanghai, Shanghai in the 1880s, if we were to present the idea to somebody from Beijing to say Shanghai has culture, the person would say, what are you talking about? But then for Shanghai in the 1930s to have culture and art and cultural expressions of its own, it's much more closely connected with Shanghai's interactions with the outside world, right? It's been a migrant city. It's been in the midst of wars and revolutions. And then at the same time, somehow it tries to stay the course of being pragmatic and doing things which were of market value. So Beijing was the center of political ideology. Shanghai was the center of cultural pragmatism. In Shanghai, you could call something national goods by taking into it all kinds of components. In Beijing, if you call your thing national learning, then you better know everything from Confucius to the present, and with minimal dilution, so to speak, to the content of your learning. So the two cities are constantly in positions of rivalry, and Beijing has its advantage, but to a high degree it's connected. It's very much connected with intellectuals and the overarching public concerns of the nation.
Can you address the issue of Mao's antagonism for Shanghai?
I'm sorry, I didn't get
the antagonism of Mao Zedong against Shanghai.
Well, Mao Zedong was a very interesting figure with regard to Shanghai. He actually spent some time in Shanghai in 1923 to 1924. He stayed in Shanghai for a couple of months and lived in the foreign concessions. He was also certainly there in 1921 as the one of the delegates to the First Party Congress. But thereafter, much of his experience was elsewhere, outside of the city. Now, the city, of course, it's far away from Mao's base, so to speak, right? Let me backtrack a little bit. Now, the whole question has something to do with Shanghai's place in the making of the Chinese Communist Revolution, which led to the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. In the 1920s and 1930s, Shanghai was actually a fairly active center of left-wing activities in favor of a revolutionary restructuring of the Chinese nation and state. And yet these people adopted this strategy that, first of all, privilege, education, and the change of people's consciousness over the means of the use of violence. In other words, they believe that a more effective way to build a new China is to educate people and to use magazines and journals to change people's way of thinking. So eventually you gain control of public opinion as well as legislative process, and you achieve transformation of China without going through means of violence. That's one line. Now, people who took that line tend to be intellectuals from elsewhere, socialists of all persuasions. They believe in debates. They believe in going to prison. They believe in lecturing in universities. Mao simply had no patience in that. He said, sitting in jail is not going to help this revolution. The better or more efficient way to achieve revolutionary success is to build an army and to seize power by force. So Shanghai obviously was not an ideal site for anybody to do that kind of thing, to build your army. So with regard to means of violence, the Chinese Communist Party was active in Shanghai up to the mid-1930s, using Shanghai as a base for underground intelligence work as well as mass organizations. They were very operative, and Zhou Enlai was the person who personally led that kind of endeavor. But still, in the mid-1930s, the underground network of the Chinese Communist Party was broken by the intelligence operation of the nationalist government, so that the remnant elements of the underground Chinese Communist Party had to leave Shanghai altogether and retreated into the base areas in along provincial borders. So you could see that from Mao's perspective, Shanghai was the city, right? In that sense, for all practical purposes, Shanghai represented the city which was the stronghold of nationalist control, of Europeanized or westernized capital, of a middle class and upper middle class, of capitalists, and of Protestant Christian teaching, all of that anathema or in opposition to many of the foundational elements of the Chinese Communist Party, especially in connection with the strategies that Mao had chosen for the making of the Chinese Communist Revolution in the 1930s.
I think we have time for one more question. Does anybody have a further question for that? So I think we had a lively dialogue and certainly given us much deeper appreciation for many of these issues. And I want to thank you so much for coming to share.
Thank you. Thank you. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much.